Guten Abend, Salam alaikum, bonsoir, guten Abend. Good evening, Polly Rosedale. Good evening, Wes Dixon. First of all, I would like to express our apologies since the representative of the United States Embassy, who was supposed to sit on your chair, Polly, tonight, received instructions from Washington that she was requested not to speak here tonight, which makes us quite disappointed because we were hoping, following a very enthusiastic speech from President Obama last week, to have a good exchange with her, but that is unfortunately not possible. So we asked Polly Rosedale, who's working for a very interesting project, a bit at the other end of the scene really, a project called Life After Guantanamo, to tell us a bit about her experience. On my left is Wes Dixon. You saw Wes in the film. Wes has been working for the Center for Constitutional Rights since 2006, where he has been challenging the detention of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. He represents clients in federal court and before military commissions at Guantanamo, including men from Algeria, China, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Somalia. And one of his clients is Jamel Amezian, who we saw the brother in the film, and paintings also in the film. So, yeah, I'm going to turn to you once immediately. You just returned from Guantanamo. Can you tell us a bit about what you saw there?
Sure. Well, thank you all. And I actually did not just return from Guantanamo. I was supposed to be in Guantanamo a few weeks ago, but my flight was canceled because, as you may have heard, there's a hunger strike that is going on now, and of the 166 men who remain at Guantanamo, about 2/3 are on hunger strike, and a number of those men, 35 I think is the current count, are being force-fed. So suffice to say that the military is somewhat preoccupied with forcing these men to eat in order to stay alive. And really the hunger strike represents, I think, a rapid escalation of what has been a tragedy at Guantanamo that's been unfolding for a number of years. You saw in the film the story of Mr. Amezian, which I think is typical of some of the other men, including my colleagues' clients. Jamel Amezian has been approved for transfer for years, and not only is he approved for transfer, but the military acknowledged back in 2008 that there was no military rationale to detain him. So not just clear as a matter of discretion, but they've said there's no military reason to detain him. But yet today he is living in isolation, in an isolation cell for 22 to 24 hours a day, and he's starving himself to death. He's lost, I think, 60 pounds, the last letter that I received from him about a week ago, and is very much at risk. And it raises the question of how did we get here? How did we get to the point where an individual like this, or like Ahmed Al-Bacha, is starving himself to death in a prison that no one thinks should remain open, and specifically with respect to these guys, no one thinks should be detained. How did we get to this point? And if you look back at the history of Guantanamo, it was designed to be a place where no laws apply. It was supposed to be outside the law entirely, which is a concept that our organization, the Center for Constitutional Rights and Reprieve, and others challenged in court. And we spent a lot of time in court in the early 2000s arguing with the U.S. government about whether these men even have the right to go into court to make a challenge to their detention. By 2008, that question was resolved, and the men do indeed have the right to go to court to challenge their detention, at least in theory. And also by 2008, we had President Obama was then candidate for president, was promising to close the prison. And in fact, when he was elected and came into office, he issued an executive order on his second day in office, promising to close the prison. And the way he went about that was his administration created a task force, an interagency task force that reviewed every individual who was detained and put people into one of three categories. You're either approved for transfer, slated for prosecution at some point in some forum, or put into a category of indefinite detention, which is a category, parenthetically, that we disagree with and think is unlawful. But in any case, most of the men in Guantanamo were approved for transfer, including Jamel, including Ahmed Babacha. And in fact, the president began to transfer a number of people. I think that there were about 75 people transferred during his first 2 years in office. But unfortunately, the president lost the initiative for reasons that are too long and complicated to explain. Lost the initiative and surrendered debate about the closure of Guantanamo to his political opponents, which culminated in January of 2011 in legislation that made it much more difficult, although not impossible, just more difficult for the president to transfer people. And since that time, there really haven't been any transfers. So you have a situation where most people are approved for transfer. No one thinks they should be there. And you have a president who wants to close the prison, but you have very little, you have no real practical effort to close the prison, at least in the last few years. And this has created a sense of tremendous desperation among these men. I mean, they are on hunger strike, not to make political statements, not to act out, but because they're desperate. I mean, they are utterly hopeless at this point that they're ever going to be released from Guantanamo. And, you know, ironically, I think it's the hunger strike and the escalation of the hunger strike over the last month or two that has gotten the attention of the public. I mean, it has certainly gotten the attention of European governments here. We saw, I think it was a week ago, the European Parliament passed a resolution calling for the closure of Guantanamo. And it's gotten President Obama's attention. He's given at least 2 public addresses recently where he has reaffirmed his desire to close the prison and has said that he's going to take steps to do that. That's something that we certainly welcome and encourage him to do and are here to work with him to accomplish. I think the question is whether that's actually going to happen. It's, you know, how is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? Because if I tell you this with certainty, if it doesn't happen, these men are going to die. I think that is certain. I mean, they have reached a degree of hopelessness, a level of desperation that I've not seen before, and I've been doing this for a long time. So, you know, again, we have a president who has authority currently today to close Guantanamo. I think the question is whether he will use it. That really remains to be seen.
Yeah, how many people are still in Guantanamo at the moment? How many detainees?
So right now there are 166 men who remain, and of those men, 86 are approved for transfer. So more than half have been approved for transfer. I think it's important to understand what it means to be approved for transfer. It means that as a result of this interagency task force that I mentioned, every military, law enforcement, or intelligence agency that has a stake in Guantanamo has looked at this individual and determined unanimously. So every agency agrees that the person can be released without threat to the United States or its allies. So, you know, when we talk about being cleared for release, it's more than just being cleared. It's a determination as well that someone doesn't pose a threat, which just underscores, in a way, the unbelievable quandary that we're in, because these men are again starving themselves as we speak.
And can you explain us, and maybe in simple words, why these people who have been approved for transfer are still in Guantanamo?
You know, it's an excellent question. It's one I wish I knew. You know, I wish I knew the answer to. I mean, there is no justifiable reason. I think it's a failure of politics. It's a failure of political will. As I mentioned, the Obama administration started out very well on Guantanamo. They transferred a number of people to their home countries, resettled a number of individuals, including in European countries. It was very, very successful, but there are a lot of people who, in the U.S. Congress, who are opposed to the closure of Guantanamo for political reasons. And I think, frankly, my perception is that the president reached a point where it was increasingly difficult to transfer people, although not impossible. And he had other legislative priorities that he wanted to address and accomplish. The United States, as everyone I think knows, firearms are a major issue, and he wanted to curb the use of firearms. He wanted to pass immigration reform, healthcare reform, and he wanted to be reelected. And I think, unfortunately, the status quo was acceptable to him. That is, he was willing to trade the men in Guantanamo in some respects for these other legislative initiatives. At least that's the way it seems to me. But what is clear is that there's really a lack of political will, because he has the authority. I mean, the United States Congress has meddled in these affairs for a long time. I mean, they've made it difficult for the president to transfer people. That's clear and obvious. But it's also clear that he still has the authority. And it seems, increasingly that he has the support of the international community. My own personal sense is that there's a lot of momentum, both domestically in the United States and here in Europe as well, to support this effort. And the question remains whether the president's going to take advantage of that renewed momentum and get some of these people out. I mentioned before, a lot of European countries accepted men for resettlement. There are only now in Guantanamo, I think, about a dozen men who need to be resettled. That is, men who can't go to their own country for fear of persecution. Mr. Mezian is one, and Ahmed Balacha is another, Polly's client. And so, in terms of efforts to practical steps to close the prison, this is sort of an easy one, right? Transferring these 86 men who were approved, only a very small number needing resettlement. It should be a relatively simple process. Again, it's the politics that are complicated.
Thanks for that. Before turning to Polly, I'd like to say that we have two key people in the room. On the first row there, Sophie Weller, who co-produced the film and whom we're seeing the film, and Jenny Oscroft. And Jenny and Sophie are both lawyers with the Center for Constitutional Rights, also quite active on this case and many other cases. Now, Polly, if I can turn to you, you have been doing quite an important work to help detainees to resettle in Europe. Can you tell us a bit about that? How does that?
I also just wanted to thank CCR. I'd actually not seen the film before, and it's incredibly moving. And I was struck by parallels with the case of our client Ahmed Balacha, as you say. But I think they've done such a good job at humanising Jamal, because I think men, for people like Wells, who are obviously very close to the men, who know men very well, his particular painting talents or his literary talents become part of that everyday knowledge of someone. But I think it's easy to forget that that's not what most of the world associates with men in Guantanamo, who have been painted as monsters for so long. So. But just to come back to your question, yes. So I run a project at Reprieve. Reprieve is a legal charity, much like the Center for Constitutional Rights, who represents men in Guantanamo Bay. But I specifically run a project called Life After Guantanamo, which was started in 2009 with the idea to assist men, facilitate their reintegration and rehabilitation after their release. I actually kind of wear two hats, because as it was made clear to me a couple of weeks after starting that job in 2009, I wasn't going to be able to rehabilitate anyone if they weren't out. So I've been doing quite a lot of the advocacy work alongside trying to facilitate and support rehabilitation and integration. So that's a project that is funded by the United Nations, and we've been working for the last 4 years with about 20 men who have been resettled in Europe and more recently in North Africa as well, trying to ensure that they have access to medical support and psychological support and social support, all the things that they would need after a decade of detention and inhuman and degrading treatment and sometimes torture.
And is that a very difficult process, or is it straightforward? Can you give us a few maybe examples of success stories or stories that have been maybe a bit more difficult, more challenging?
I think when people ask me that question, I'm always rather disappointed by my response, because actually the stories are rather banal. Their needs are much like all of our needs. Their priorities are often things like getting married, take many phone calls about how to find a wife, how to start wanting to start a family, wanting to catch up on their lost years of education and find work. Things that we in Western Europe are actually very experienced at handling. We know these kinds of issues well. We have a history of welcoming refugees over many years, and I think we're well placed to help men in this way. So not much drama, I'm afraid.
Okay, but it's possible. It's possible to have a normal life after that.
It's definitely possible, and I've been lucky enough to see men have reunited with their wives, have babies, get jobs. All of those things that are essential for all of us.
Sure. Well, so probably before turning to the audience who may have comments or questions to you, would you like to add anything?
I'll just say this. I mean, the Center for Constitutional Rights and Reprieve have been working with detainees for a long time, and in a number of capacities. I mean, I in addition to representing Jamel, I represent an individual who's charged by a military commission. It's a very different kind of case, and in many ways a more complicated case. For men like Ahmed Balach and Jamel Mezian, it's not complicated. It's easy. It's a question of politics, and for us, really, it's become. I mean, recently, in particular, it's become very much about addressing their desperation, their hopelessness, and representing them for a long time. And we've been telling their stories in Europe for quite a while. My colleagues were here in Luxembourg in 2010, and actually came with a former detainee from the United Kingdom, who was touched and moved by the support that he received from the public here, from the foreign ministry, and there was a lot of sympathy, and I have to underscore how important that sympathy is to people like Jamel and to Ahmed. I mean, these men are desperate. They are on hunger strike because they think they will never get released from Guantanamo, even though nobody thinks that they're terrorists. I mean, it's not something you need to take our word for. I mean, the U.S. government has conceded this, and so for them to know and to hear and to see sympathy, to know that people care, not just in the United States but in Europe and throughout the world, is very, very important to them. It gives them some measure of hope. And so certainly when I get back to the United States and when I go to Guantanamo again to see him, I'll tell him about these things we've been doing here, and hopefully we'll give him a little bit of hope, because I think that's what he needs right now.
Polly?
No, I think that's right, and their hopes have been raised so many times. I know there was great expectations that once Obama's second term began, that finally then he would really fulfill the promise that he'd made in 2009. And of course that didn't happen. And I think the timing of the hunger strike is not coincidental. I think, you know, a couple of months after President Obama coming to office again, men realised that really, if they didn't express themselves in the only way that was then available to them, by starving themselves to death as a protest, at their desperate plight, then they would continue as they are, indefinitely detained. And I think, I congratulate them actually, because I think the world has started looking again. And I just regret that it's taken something as dangerous and as serious as this for people to remember that Guantanamo Bay is not closed. As well said, Sophie and I were here 3 years ago, and I wish, although I'm delighted to be on the platform with you, I wish we didn't have to be here again.
I think it's now time for you to intervene if you want to. Would anybody want to ask a question or make a comment? I've got a microphone that is running around with Antonia. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you my name is Amnesty. For being here. You must be very disappointed that there are only a dozen people in this room. There should be 10, 20, 50 times more. Where are the young people? It seems there's a university in Luxembourg. You can go to any place in Europe where there's a university, young people show up. This is Luxembourg. It's very sad, it's very depressing. I'm Luxembourg. It's my passport. That's all that is Luxembourg in me, I hope. So, Guantanamo Bay is a personal obsession for me, and I'm therefore very thankful. I was never there. I had if there are some Luxembourgers here, I had, at the very beginning of Guantanamo Bay, a major controversy in Luxembourg, when a Luxembourg journalist, Adi Richard, meanwhile, was rather a good friend, but perhaps he learned his lesson, was taken on a VIP flight to Guantanamo Bay and had an interview with the camp, the boss of the camp, and came back very enthusiastic about the idyllic condition. I wrote a letter. Luxembourg refused to publish it first, and I had to write to the head and tried my best. Finally, they published it with an infamous comment by themselves. That was at the very beginning. So that's a minor personal experience. But watching this, I was less enthralled by this film, I'm sorry for saying this, than some of you. In fact, we didn't learn that much about this unfortunate young fellow, but a few minor points. I don't want to talk long, and have not been invited as a speaker here. As I said, I'm following this very close, as closely as I can. I depend on media, mainstream, mainly Western media, and so I don't know how valid is what I or anybody of us here about the situation, the dying, the suffering, this torture, force-feeding people starving, dying, but might this not be a conscious strategy or stratagem to finally a very extremely cynical, it's even hard to think about, a cynical approach to give the whole predicament in the end, a physical solution, that when the last prisoner will have died one way or the other, then the camp can be closed. Then another point, I don't go too far in this room with these very few brave people here who came, but me at least, Guantanamo, and it should all of us it should remind us that Auschwitz is still possible. And Guantanamo Bay, I think, that's how I see it, is keeping the infamous flame alive. We should not forget, Guantanamo Bay, it's not a prison, it's an annihilation camp. It breaks people. It doesn't just humiliate people and break them, but it's destroying them. So, and the last point perhaps, I wrote down a few reflections while you talked. Take the case of Auschwitz, to come back to this. Germany, the 30s, the totalitarian country, fascist, Nazi, whatever you call it, there was practically no opposition. And people asked after the war, why was this so? People said, we didn't know. Even those who lived close by, didn't they know? I think they didn't want to look, they looked away. So that's the frightening thing about it. But in the United States, people say it's a democracy. Even in this room, not me, but there are people in this room who think the United States is democracy, whatever that means. But why is there not a massive mobilization of people, an enormous outcry of the American public against this monstrosity called Guantanamo Bay? So this raises painful questions, a worrisome question about the quality of the American political system, if you call it then, or Western democracy. Very, very, very difficult questions. And also about, somebody mentioned the word international community. I don't know whether that person who meant it ironically, because what is this international community who is supposed to stand up for certain values whenever there's some problem in the world? But yes, I finished there. But this international community, I think I finished there.
Yeah.
We should think.
Let me just say,
ask ourselves what kind of role it plays. Is it not a very shameful role? The political elites, the journalists, the media, the so-called intellectuals, all those of which consist this so-called international community. We should ask questions about this very, very shameful role. And I mean, perhaps it's too late for this, and these few people who are sitting here. We can't do anything. It's a feeling of helplessness, isn't it? In us, we can be full of rage and full of shame ourselves. I'm full of shame of belonging to a community, humans.
Let me interject for a moment, because I was the one that made the comment about the international community and was talking about the Obama administration. Just say this: I mean, there are a lot of things that have gone very wrong with Guantanamo. I mean, from the original concept to the lack of transfers currently. But I do think we are at a unique point in time where the international community, and I refer specifically to the European Parliament, the resolution that they just passed, and the President of the United States, Barack Obama, has spoken publicly on several occasions recently, and we as advocates for the men detained are in agreement, I think, at this point in time about the need to close the prison and about some of the failures that have occurred in the past, but really are focused on the way forward, which is what to do about the men who remain now in 2013. I mean, we could write volumes, and volumes have been written about the egregious rights violations that have occurred in Guantanamo, in the broader war on terror, and who's responsible and who's victimized. That's important. It needs to be done as a matter of history. But what really matters to Jamal Nessian and to Ahmed Babache is getting out. We are at a point now, I firmly believe, where the interests are very much aligned between the detainees, the United States government, and the international community to do something, to bring about what I think everyone agrees should happen, which is the closure of the prison. I do think we're at that point, and I think one of the challenges for us, certainly a challenge for the U.S. government, and is to figure out what concrete steps can be taken to achieve that goal. Guantanamo is a U.S. problem in the sense that it was an institution created by the United States with the assistance of others. But the solution isn't a uniquely American solution. The President of the United States needs assistance to accomplish the closure of the prison. And it's certainly our hope that the international community will assist him, will assist our clients to achieve, again, what I think everybody at this point in time thinks is the right result, which is closure of the prison.
Yeah, it was an important exchange. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Angel Ali, living in Luxembourg, Israel. I just had one point with question on actually details of, obviously directed to you, Tony. But Jamal, do we know who did he come in contact with when he was in Afghanistan, and did he have perhaps acquaintances that would actually justify, well, maybe under Homeland Security or emergency preparedness, like all those bills dictated after September 11th? Did he actually was in some equivocal situations for acquaintances that would actually justify the fact that he would still be detained, even though he was judged to be free, well, able to be freed still now?
Yeah, so I mean that's it's a question that we're frequently asked, and it's one that is relatively easy to address in his case. You mentioned Homeland Security. Department of Homeland Security in the United States is one of the agencies that is part of the task force that approved him for transfer, that concluded unanimously that there was no basis to detain him. In terms of the facts of his case, I mean, his story, I think you get some sense, hopefully from the film, is sort of the classic refugee story, immigrant story. He left Algeria to avoid civil war and applied for a work permit, and had a work permit in Vienna, applied for political asylum when he was in Canada. This is not sort of an individual who's sneaking across borders for nefarious purposes. He's very upfront about what he was trying to do, which is to rebuild a life for himself, but was denied time again, and basically panics, for lack of a better term, when he's denied asylum in Canada, and he goes to Afghanistan. He's there for a very short period of time and is sort of floating around trying to figure out what to do, but is not accused by the United States government of doing anything, not accused of training, not accused of fighting, not accused of doing any of the things that might concern you as a citizen, that might give you pause. Just not applicable to him. The main public allegation against him, the allegations that the U.S. government has said publicly, is that he traveled on a false passport. Well, you know what he did, because he went and he flew from Vienna to Montreal, as you saw in the film, and got to the airport and raised his hands and said, "I'm here, I'm Algerian, I'm applying for asylum." So it's not really any more complicated than that.
Can I just perhaps add that, I mean, I think it's easy now to ask that question from this particular standpoint in history, but you have to remember that we weren't at war with Afghanistan then, and it was a perfectly legitimate thing to do. So I just wanted to add that.
Any more questions, comments? Yes, please. If you can introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Claude Weber from the Luxembourg League of Human Rights. And, well, first of all, I would like to thank for the film, which shows an important aspect of the question, humanizing the prisoner. It's very important to individualize and to humanize the cases. But I have a problem, not with the film, but with what we could infer from that portrait. For me, human rights are not granted only to sympathetic persons, but to all persons in the world. And we at our league have a lot of cases with persons who are not sympathetic at all, but who have rights, and we have to fight for their rights. I think we must really make a distinction between the general treatment of the prisoners at Guantanamo and their legal status at Guantanamo, and on the other side, the reintegration of so-called innocent, not so-called, but declared innocent persons. These are, for me, two different problems. We should perhaps separate. I would like to ask a question about the detention conditions of those people who are declared innocent or releasable. Are they better than, are they different from the detention conditions of so-called terrorists, or are they the same conditions? And then about the freeing of these people. Why isn't it possible to release people who are declared by American authorities as innocent? Why isn't it possible to release them to the United States? It's a very, very big country, and I think the United States should be able to absorb 80 persons, or not.
Well, I'll just begin with that, and I would say that I agree with you. As a legal matter, as a political matter, yes, I think that men like Jamal Ghazi or Ahmed Belbachev, if they're unable to go to their own country, should be resettled in the United States. But I can also tell you categorically that that's not going to happen. And so, you know, as advocates for these men, you know, we firmly agree with you, but the reality is that that's not going to happen. That was an issue that was one of the issues, I think, that led to the loss of momentum on the part of the Obama administration in early 2009. There was a plan to bring some of the Uyghurs, the Chinese Uyghurs, to the United States. It fell apart, and it was at that point, really, that the president's focus and emphasis on Guantanamo really began to slip. So at this point, it's all but an impossibility, unfortunately, for men like our clients. Second, I'll just say, you know, I agree with you entirely that you know, that the men who are declared innocent, for lack of a better term, are not any more or less entitled to respect for human rights or even civil rights, you know, granted by countries. That's why I think, you know, in addition to the European Parliament resolution, there have been a number of statements recently by human rights officials and international organizations about the legality of the continuing detention. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, issued a statement. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights issued a statement. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. They've all issued statements recently that have underscored the arbitrariness of the detention, the need for abandonment of military commissions, for example, which is another issue entirely that gets to the issue you're raising. And these statements are made and applicable to everyone, even those accused of the attacks on 9/11. I remember those attacks, and I from New York. I remember, and yet I think when in terms of public education, when people hear stories like the stories of Jamal Mazian or Ahmed Labacha, I think it's startling, because I think it really underscores or dispels this notion about who's detained in Guantanamo. These men were so demonized in 2002, 2003, that it's very hard to recover from that. And I think that these stories sort of address that. These are the easy cases. Jamal Mazian and Ahmed Labacha are two of the easiest cases in Guantanamo. If you're the president and you want to close the prison, these are the men you want to start with, because they're easy. But they're no more or less entitled to respect for human rights or civil rights than any of the men who are detained there. And both of our organizations, as I mentioned before, do a lot of work on behalf of some of the more complicated cases.
Polly, would you like to add something?
Well, just that you're not the only one who wondered why they couldn't be resettled in America. And in fact, there are communities in the US who have stepped forward to offer homes. In fact, Amherst in Massachusetts wanted to welcome our client Ahmed Belbasha, exactly because of the, they saw the kind of human side of these stories, as well as we're saying. But yeah, it's not going to happen.
I can just remind, there was a question about the conditions of detention of those who are approved to be released, and yeah, those who are...
So I'll just say conditions of detention have changed over time at Guantanamo. When Ahmed Belbasha and Jamal Mazian arrived in Guantanamo in 2002, in Jamal's case, there was a lot of physical brutality at Camp X-Ray, which is sort of the picture postcard of Guantanamo, the open air, the dog cages. By the time I started traveling to Guantanamo at the end of 2005, conditions had changed, and the men were put in what permanent prison facilities known as Camps 5 and 6. These are modeled on the maximum security prisons in the United States. And they were being held in isolation. It was 22, 23, 24 hours a day in isolation. And it was a different kind of torment, and it was, I think, far, far worse for the men than what they had experienced in Camp X-Ray with physical brutality, or even prior to Guantanamo when they were being held in transit in places like Kandahar or Bagram. One of the things that changed when President Obama was elected were the conditions of confinement. He came into office and he made a commitment to close the prison, and to his credit, improved conditions of confinement. Things did get better for a number of the men who were held in Guantanamo. Not for everybody, but for many of the men who were held there. There was increased access to family, increased access to the outside world, increased interaction among the detainees. Jamal Mazian was able to paint. One of the things that he's spent a lot of time doing to occupy his time. But since this hunger strike has begun, conditions have gotten worse. I mean, they've reverted back to 2002, 2003 in many ways. The hunger strike began in February and increased and sort of spread slowly. And in mid-April, I think, I don't know, it certainly seems to me that the military felt that it was losing control of the strike, losing control of who was at risk of dying. And, unfortunately, rather than trying to address the underlying grievances that these men have, the military raided the camp and sort of went in, stormed in with force, and put each of these men back into single cell isolation. So Jamal Mazian today is in Camp 6, and he's locked in isolation for 22, 23, 24 hours a day, just the way he was when I first started meeting with him in 2000. I think I first met in 2006. So, it's brought the men back in time, which has been devastating for them. I can give you one example. Mr. Mezzi wrote a letter to me dated May 19th, and I just give you a sample of what he said. He said, so far I've lost 60 pounds. This is since February. The situation here is too bad. It's so bad that a couple of days ago, 2 inmates in my block attempted suicide. One hung himself with a sheet. The other cut the vein of his wrist. They were taken to the detainee hospital. I haven't seen them again. Because of the hell we are living here, I'm really expecting people to die. Instead of resolving the problem, the authorities here are pushing us to the extreme. I feel that they really want us to die. What is currently happening here has never happened before, even in the dark days of the Bush administration. I think what's remarkable here is, as I said before, there is an emerging consensus, I think, among the detainees, the Obama administration, and the international community that the prison needs to be closed. But, I don't know whether that's filtering down to the level of the guard force at Guantanamo. I don't know. But clearly there is a disconnect. There is a gap, if you will, between the politics of Guantanamo, the need to close it, the desire, expressed desire of the Obama administration to do this, to close it, and what the men are experiencing on a daily basis. I mean, it's irreconcilable, and that it raises the question: what's going to happen? Is this going to be like 2009, where the Obama administration lost the initiative and transfers all but ceased, or is this time going to be different? And I think that script has yet to be written. And we're here. I'm over from New York. Polly, Jenny, Sophie are here from London to try to take advantage of some of this momentum, to try to generate sympathy for these men, because that's what they need. And I can only hope that the U.S. government similarly takes advantage of this momentum, because this is perhaps the last best chance that the U.S. will have to achieve closure of the prison, and really to shut this door, to end this chapter in the history of the United States and beyond the United States, this chapter of the world.
I think it's just worth saying that the last person to have left Guantanamo was a Yemeni called Adnan Latif, who committed suicide in September last year. And of course, we don't want the next person to be another death. And I think we are really getting very close to that now. Both our client Ahmed and Jamal are on hunger strike, and Ahmed has been force-fed actually for the last 6 weeks, which means having a nasogastric tube inserted very painfully into his nose and into the stomach twice a day, and against all his consent and against all medical ethics. So there is definitely a sense, as well said, of a disconnect between the politics and the practice in Guantanamo, and certainly the perception is from detainees that the response to the hunger strike, which, as I said, is really their only legitimate means to contest their indefinite detention, has been a punitive one.
Any more questions, comments? Yes, please.
I had a question about the conditions for release. Are there special conditions for release for the prisoners? Do they have to sign a declaration, a general disclaimer, for example, that they won't file the American government, or do you know something about?
Sure. So
conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you I've had a number of clients released from Guantanamo over the years. None that I know of has been required to sign any form of document, either acknowledging any form of guilt or promising to do anything in the future. Transfers from Guantanamo are negotiated on a bilateral basis. between the United States government and the receiving government. We are, as advocates for these men, are not privy to those negotiations or those discussions. I represent Jamel Mezzi, I don't represent the United States. I'm not part of those discussions. So, what conditions are put on these men is not something I have a lot of insight into. There are a number of issues that do come up from time to time with men who have been resettled, which I think Polly can tell you more about. But currently there are, these men have been, men like Jamel and Ahmed have been approved for transfer, so they've been through this interagency process that has determined they're no threat. There has been created by the U.S. Congress a certification process. That is, there has to be issued a certification by the Secretary of Defense that ensures, for example, that the receiving country will, keep these men out of trouble, for lack of a better term. And that certification process has prevented, I think, politically prevented transfers. It's a complicated process. For a receiving country, it's a fairly onerous process. These are governments that are to my view, assisting the United States with closing Guantanamo, and are being asked to guarantee that they're going to look after these men. And so there's a disconnect there. But the conditions themselves are negotiated bilaterally, as best I can tell. But I don't know, maybe you want to address something.
No, I think that's right. So 4 years ago, the Luxembourg Framework Agreement was signed amongst the EU member states, which gave all member states flexibility. It gave them the opportunity, should they want to resettle the men who couldn't return home, but gave them flexibility as to how they handled that. So each country that has taken men, I think there have been 37 men resettled in Europe under the Obama administration, has done it really in their own way. There are obviously some commonalities, but they're all according to their own, residence and immigration laws. So.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add too, the men in Guantanamo understand the reality of these negotiations, even though obviously they're not privy to them. And men like Jamel are perfectly willing to comply with whatever receiving country might ask of them. If it's checking in with the police or what have you, they're perfectly willing to consent. As a matter of law, they shouldn't be required to do that, and may not be required to do that under a country's laws. But they're certainly willing to meet the United States and receiving countries halfway, so to speak, and to do what's necessary. They want to get out of Guantanamo, and these men, they don't have anything to hide. Jamel Mezzi and Ahmed Belbacha are going to be a problem for no one, and so they'll do whatever is necessary, whether they're legally obligated to or not. They will.
That wasn't my question.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
My question was: is it conceivable that an innocent former detainee could ask for reparation against the American government?
Oh, yes. Yes. The answer is yes. There are a number of cases that have been filed by our organization. We've filed on behalf of some of the men who've been released. I can tell you that those efforts fail universally in U.S. federal court. They're not successful for a number of legal reasons. I think having worked with, still being in communication with a lot of them who have been transferred from Guantanamo, I think a simple apology would suffice for many of them. But that's not been forthcoming. Maybe there'll be a day, maybe there'll be a time, maybe there'll be a place where there is an apology issued to Jamel Messian years after he's released. It won't be soon. It won't be by this administration. It may not be for many, many years. But we don't give up hope that will happen.
It's a really important question, actually, and I should have mentioned this earlier when you were asking me about the experience of former detainees. As well said, one of the most difficult challenges for them is living without acknowledgement of what they've been through. And of course they're very stigmatized by many in society when they're released. So without a public apology, it is very difficult for them to move on. I think the only case which has come close to compensation, it was actually a settlement, was the case of the UK residents who where the British government admitted their complicity in torture, and there was a settlement, financial settlement.
And the only these it's not just reparations and apology. And there's you never get a piece of paper that says I was wrongly detained, and which presents a challenge sometimes for men who've been detained. If they're trying to get employment, and people say, "Oh, we were in Guantanamo. Oh, the employment opportunities disappeared." We were successful. I was successful. In one case this past year, I represented a man from Somaliland, sort of the northeastern part of Somalia, and I was able to negotiate on his behalf, as a matter of public record, a letter from the United States government saying that they don't consider him to be a terrorist based on his detention at Guantanamo without charge, that he should not be considered a terrorist, which may not sound like a lot, but was very meaningful to him, and was very significant. I think it's the only time that anyone's gotten a letter like that. But we were able to get it, and he holds on to that letter. He cherishes that letter because it's helped him move on with his life. And this is a person who lost 8 years of his life to Guantanamo, and is now trying to move on from that. And this piece of paper helps him do that.
Yes, please.
Hi. Please don't take this as an attack. It's just an observation. In the case of Jamal, the fact that you want him, or his brother more particularly, repatriated to Canada, could it be like you could be just not helping him by that because Algeria is not at war anymore? He's seeking asylum in a few countries, and if he's able to be free, and the normal path would perhaps be his birthland and homeland, and perhaps the fact that his brother wants him in Canada, you are issuing multiple requests about him going to a certain Western countries when there's perhaps not needs to anymore. The fact that the question will remain by whom will he be prosecuted back in Algeria, and in which conditions, because he's left the country so long ago. That's just an observation. The second point for me, and perhaps to Polly, will be do you have just a profile of the remaining detainees of Guantanamo? Is there a reluctance from the government, for the American government, to release a certain particular type of detainees? Why are they all still there? The few of them that are remaining might have something in common. They might have something there that that could, I don't know. So much of them have been released so far. So why are these people still, more after 10 years, still there?
Well, in terms of your second question, as I said before, when President Obama came into office, he put together a task force that was comprised of all of the relevant government agencies to review these cases, and the overwhelming majority of people were determined to be eligible for transfer. They were cleared for release, which I said before is a unanimous decision that someone doesn't pose a threat. The Obama administration was successful in transferring a number of those men, but a number of those men still remain. And so, the idea that the implication that only the difficult cases remain, I think is not exactly right. And in terms of the men not cleared for release. You know, you look back at the history of Guantanamo, the single greatest determining factor in whether someone is transferred from Guantanamo is their citizenship. So what country you're from. So if you're from a Western European country, you are released early. You know, if you're from France or from the United Kingdom, you're released early. If you are, on the other hand, from the country of Yemen, which you know presents a number of complicating challenges, not having to do with the men themselves, but just in terms of geopolitics of the region. You know, there have been very, very few transfers to that country. If you look at the remaining population of 166 men, 89 of those men are from the country of Yemen. So it doesn't have anything to do with the facts of their case. It doesn't have anything to do with whether men are dangerous or not dangerous. In many ways, it doesn't even have to do with whether they're cleared for transfer or not. It has to do with the fact that they're from Yemen. And one of the things that the president committed to doing when he spoke about 10 days ago was to address the problem of Yemen. That is to lift this moratorium that he had imposed on transfers to Yemen as a way to address this issue. You know, it remains to be seen whether anyone from Yemen is actually transferred, but this is a step in the right direction. In terms of Algeria, I'm going to say this. You know, as a matter of U.S. law, as a matter of international law, you know, the convention against torture, or what have you, cases are addressed individually, you know, person by person. And there have been a number of men who have been sent to Algeria. Some of those men have been fined. Some of them have not. There's one person who's been seriously persecuted since his forced return to Algeria in 2010. It's a terrible, terrible time. And you know, in Mr. Mezian's case, you know, it is certainly true that had he volunteered to go to Algeria, he wouldn't be in Guantanamo at this point. But you know, he may very well be dead. You know, we don't know that, but it was more likely than not that he would experience some form of persecution. And you know, the reason for that is not tied to anything that he's accused of doing. It has to do with the stigma of Guantanamo. You know, if you have been in Guantanamo, you by definition have been labeled the worst of the worst. Remember, this is what was said about Guantanamo back in 2002, that everybody there was a dangerous, vicious killer. And that just wasn't right, but the stigma remains. And that's something you have to contend with. And I think in Jamel's case, you add to that the fact that he's from a persecuted minority group in Algeria. The prospects are, you know, it's very dangerous for him to go back. And his family has been adamant that he would suffer persecution if he were returned. And you know, to say that, you know, as a family or you know, as an advocate for a person like that, is not easy. You know, to say that as Jamel said back in 2008 when they tried to transfer to Algeria, they said I'd rather stay in Guantanamo at that time than risk death or torture or persecution in Algeria, is not a decision that's taken lightly. It's only taken with, you know, it's only taken with regard to a very, very careful evaluation of the risks. And I think that's why the federal court barred that transfer at the time, because it was more likely than not that he would suffer some form of persecution, as some of the men have. You know, Jamel, for his part, is not particularly political. He doesn't have anything against Algeria. He didn't leave Algeria for political reasons. He left Algeria because he was afraid he was going to be killed during the Civil War. And now, having been in Guantanamo for a number of years, is afraid of what he would face, particularly as a member of a minority group.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, it is absolutely crucial that you see these men as individuals and deal with them on a case-by-case basis, and not underestimate the power of the word Guantanamo. In the case of Ahmed Belbasha, who's our Algerian client, who began speaking out quite critically about the Algerian government after he was detained, suddenly in 2009, charges were trumped up against him in a sham trial whilst he was in Guantanamo, so in absentia, and he was sentenced to 20 years. We've never been able to find out the basis of those charges, any evidence, and it seems that it probably recycled bogus allegations from the very early days when he arrived in Guantanamo. So, you know, I wouldn't underestimate risk in Algeria.
Yeah, and to the credit of the United States government, they have not tried to force Jamel Mezyan or Ahmed Babachir back to Algeria since coming into office. I mean, the attempts to force Mr. Mezyan back was prior to President Obama taking office. There have been two men who have been forced back, but I think given the individual determinations, Ahmed Babachir and Jamel Mezyan have not, I think, to the credit of the U.S. And to some degree, maybe the Algerians.
Okay. Any more questions? Comments? Yes, please.
I have talked before, but I'm a bit. I took the floor before because we asked at that point for it, but perhaps I should have waited. I'm a bit disappointed by this discussion. I think we must miss the chance to have a broader and deeper discussion. You seem to elude. You seem to want to keep the debate technical in a sense and narrow. I had raised some larger political but also ethical questions. These questions have been completely eluded. So that means the really important, the crucial questions have been from the beginning eluded, because it's about society, about political regime, the regime of the United States or the West, the so-called democracy. It's but perhaps it's too late anyway to have this debate. But if we don't get to the roots, then we will not be wiser than before, and there will be many more Guantanamo Bay camps. So, sorry for being, I don't want to be negative. I appreciate very much that you came here, but then I'm a bit frustrated.
I think with respect to that, I mean, we have talked about the need for accountability for these men, and I think that that's a substantial step in the direction that, the issues that you've raised. I mean, to ensure that these things don't happen again, it's necessary to have accountability for what's happened in the past. I think, and both of our organizations are very involved in trying to achieve that. But right now at this point in time, we are confronted with a situation where our clients are dying in a cell, and there's a practical urgency to what we're doing. But the Center for Constitutional Rights and Reprieve were the first organizations to challenge this notion of a prison outside the law. Back in 2002, when I remember the person who heads Reprieve or Polyworks was, had death threats called in to him because it was so unpopular and so controversial at the time. And we have come a long way, and I do think, for as much as we are critical of the government, I do think there are meaningful distinctions between the past administration and what the current administration is trying to achieve. But I think that there are practical problems, and I think, if you look at other, whether it's Latin America and the dirty wars, or you look at other conflicts, areas of conflict, it takes a long time to achieve some of the systemic changes. It takes a long time to achieve reparations, to obtain accountability, particularly at the highest levels of government. I do think those, I'm confident that will happen at some point with respect to Guantanamo. I hope it does. I think it needs to in order to truly move forward, to put this into history. But you know, it's going to take a long time, and you know, we'll see.
Okay. Yeah. Do you want to ask a question? Yeah. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Is it good? Thank you for coming. Staying with the practical things, if you were to write a letter to try and give hope to prisoners like Jamel, would he be able to receive it, and would the authorities in the prison actually give the letter to you?
Yes, the men do receive the letters. I have been to many meetings with detained men, and they bring the letters with them to meetings, and they'll say, "Oh, I received this card from Amnesty International," usually, from their letter writing campaigns, and it does make a difference. In terms of getting it, it does go through the military censor, and I think the way to get it through the military censor faster is to stay somewhat non-political. So to send an expression of sympathy, you know, I'm sorry that you're experiencing this. I wish, you know, you safe resettlement, or something as simple as I attended this screening of your film in Luxembourg. I was very moved by it. Something that simple will affirm for these men that there are people in the world who care about their situation other than their counsel, their families. These letters will get to them. It may take some time, but they will.
I understand. And then, what do you think when you will be able to go back there? Because it seems like the situation is very critical and every day counts, and you could bring good news in a certain way that, for example, the European Parliament urges the government to close the prison.
Yeah, I mean, I will probably head back to the prison in July. You know, likely in July. I'm here for a few more days, and then I'll be traveling elsewhere for a few days. So I'll probably go down in July. But Jamel certainly will hear about this event, and we'll write to him and give him a full summary of everything that happened. And we're able to do that sort of separately through legal communications, which are much faster and are virtually guaranteed to get through to him.
Thank you.
Maybe a final question.
I'd like to ask you a question about the people who are working at Guantanamo Bay. Who are they? What is their psychological condition? What is their aim working there? And how can they help us? If or not?
Yeah. So you're referring to the military personnel.
Yes, psychologists, military personnel. I suppose there are also there's no civil stuff in Guantanamo.
The only civil, I guess you call it civil society group that's there is the International Committee of the Red Cross, and they are able to meet with the men, and they are able to arrange family communication, telephone calls, video occasionally, although a lot of that has ended since the hunger strike. But they are able to facilitate that communication. The Red Cross doesn't share with us they communicate with the U.S. government confidentially. That's something they do internationally. In terms of the others who work there, the Guard Force, it's very interesting. My sense is that, well, first of all, most of the guards are young men and women, 18, 19 years old, who are right out of we would call high school, secondary school. And they join the military for any number of reasons, for financial support, as a way out of poverty, and they don't end up in Guantanamo by choice. They end up there by circumstance, and I think that they're, at this point, sort of interesting. Guantanamo's been open for more than 11 years. A lot of these young men and women have grown up with Guantanamo. It's been part of their existence, their consciousness, since they were young children. It's been open that long. They've grown up with it. They've never really known a world without Guantanamo. So it's not that unusual to them. And I think there is not an indifference, but that they are trained to identify the men, to know the men only by numbers. You saw this in the film. There was a former Navy sailor who appeared in the film, and actually I spoke on a panel with him in New York about a week ago, and it was interesting. He talked about their training, and he said, we were trained and taught that these men were dangerous, and that they would attack us at any opportunity. And he said, I sort of realized right away that that wasn't the case, but they trained us that way because it was sort of the worst case scenario. But we were prevented from knowing them. He said he didn't know any of the men when he was in Guantanamo. He's only gotten to know the men since he's left Guantanamo, left the Navy. He's made an effort to learn about the men. And I think he feels a lot of guilt, and it's been quite terrible for him. And as to my knowledge, he's not even he's not responsible for what's happened to these men. These young men and women are put in a terrible circumstance. Not to say that in the early days there weren't individuals who participated, of course, in the brutality, but I think today, 2013, I think there's just a fundamental lack of knowledge. And I have to believe, but I don't know, I have to believe that they're moved by the force feeding. I mean, there are 35 men who are being force fed twice a day in Guantanamo. It's a process that is dirty, it's bloody, it takes a long time. It involves a lot of vomit and urine and blood. It's awful. And I can't imagine that the young men and women who participate in that are not equally traumatized by it. I think you're going to see a lot more of that. A lot more of these individuals speaking out after Guantanamo's closed, talking about their own experiences and their own regrets.
Just on that, actually, yesterday an open letter was published from 13 detainees who are being force-fed, protesting against the force feeding, but in particular the way that they've been treated by the doctors and nurses who've been doing it, and saying that they cannot trust them anymore, that they are not treating them as health professionals should, and that they don't feel that they've been treated as human beings, but in fact that they've been punished by the very people who are supposed to be there to take care of them.
Okay, I think we shall close it here, at least for the moment, because you can obviously continue the discussion around a beer. A big thank you, Polly and Wells, for being here tonight, as well as Sophie and Jenny. And thanks to all of you for staying late despite a very nice weather outside. Good night.
Thank you for hosting.